My fifth great grandmother, right, Euphémie Lemelle, she was born on the plantation, the the well-known plantation of Marie Jeanne Lemelle, and I'm currently reading actually Creoles of Color in Country, and they mention it, and we're gonna I'll put up maybe some parts of it that really discuss essentially how wealthy Marie Jeanne Lemelle was, and that's my seventh great grandmother, right? So how this kind of happened is my seventh great grandmother, who was a woman of color herself, she married a white man who was clearly, he wasn't poor, and so they were in a sort of a common law marriage, and so he did have a white family, but meaning he had a white wife and white children, but he was with my seventh great grandmother, and this was François Lemelle, who was with my seventh great grandfather, who was with my seventh great grandmother, Marie Jeanne Lemelle, right? And so the thing is that's quite interesting is that he François Lemelle, when he died in about 1784, he left pretty much a lot of stuff for his, well, I don't know, for Marie Jeanne Lemelle. And a lot of people, some people have described her in works as a concubine, a side piece, anything, things of that nature. But she kind of got a lot, like the house, the land. And so what she did was she built upon that land. I'm very grateful for the Race and Slavery Petitions Project. In particular, the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, for putting together, going through and gathering these documents and writing this abstract. So this is the abstract that they wrote for their project, right? Euphémie, a free woman of color, asked the court for an injunction on the sale of her and her children as slaves and for acknowledgement of their free status. She informs the court that Juliette Marin and Jordan, free people of color, have concocted a plot to defraud her and her children of their freedom and have listed them for sale in the Bee, a New Orleans newspaper. 4 weeks ago, Euphémie's children, except for the youngest child, were taken from her by force and violence. 4 of the children were placed in a Negro trading yard under the control and in possession of J.A. Beard and Company. Her 2 oldest children, Jules and Cornelius, or Jules and Cornelius, were taken by the defendants and wrongdoers who were using them as slaves. Euphémie asks for an injunction to stop the sale for her and her children, to be recognized as free. So this is actually crazy. Like that, I mean, just to kind of, I'm gonna put up actually the newspaper that Juliette Marin and her husband put up, but essentially, just to put this into context, right? How crazy this is. Not only were they trying to sell someone into slavery who was kind of, living free, their whole life, but you have to realize this was her sister-in-law. That's really kind of gross, honestly. Like, not only are you trying to be sneaky and get a little cash, but you're throwing your sister-in-law under the bus right after your brother died. Like, that's crazy. Like, this is your sister-in-law, your nephews, your nieces. So Juliette and Jordan my seventh great grandmother purchased my sixth great grandmother Eve, who was an enslaved woman from what is now Virginia, which was being described as British mainland Creole, right? Marie Jeanne Lemelle has, this slave Eve on her plantation, and her son François Lemelle goes and has a child with one of his mother's slaves. I mean, they're all there in the plantation. And you have to realize these plantations are a bit isolated. It is pretty rural in that area, especially if we're talking about in the early 19th century, right? So stuff like that happens. I don't know the nature, and it would be inappropriate for me or anyone else to assume the nature of the relationship of my sixth grade great grandparents. Sorry, um, but that led to the birth of Euphémie Lemelle, my fifth great grandmother, who was born about 1818. Okay, and interestingly enough, it is said that she was raised like right under the wing of Marie Jeanne Lemelle, her grandmother, and so the thing is, like I said, her mother Eve was enslaved, and so she legally was enslaved, but she essentially, and this is very common in um, in Latin culture, especially where you have a person that is related to the owners of the plantation, and they are recognized, people know that they're family, and so they don't really work. They are there on paper, they are enslaved, but in real life they're not working in the fields or even really working in the house. And so that was the situation of Euphémie Lemelle. When she was born and grew up in the first half of the 19th century, she wasn't working. She was living the life of many, pretty much of any free woman of color, and she went as she pleased and did pretty much whatever she wanted, right? So um, eventually, her grandmother dies, right? And Euphemie becomes then legally the property of Marie Jeanne Lemelle's daughter, Kachi. And so so Marie Jeanne Lemelle dies about 1834, okay, and then she's now the property of her aunt Kachi, and then eventually she meets this guy, this West Indian guy who would later become my fifth great grandfather, right? He was an engineer. He was said to be a man of color, but we could assume, predominantly European. He was born in Saint Domingue and immigrated to Louisiana, and eventually they enter into a relationship that would produce several children. Okay. Uh, on September 19th, 1848, Charles Marin purchases uh, his partner, Euphémie Lemelle, as well as her sister, Andriennette, and all of their respective children. So, why if you're not really familiar with the history, you would say, like, why would you want your wife as a slave? That's kind of weird. That's like a weird vibe. Okay, but you have to think about it in this sense. This is a form of protection, because if she is the property of God knows who, that person can sell her off, decide, hey, I'm going to move to a new country, and you're legally responsible to go wherever the hell that person goes. So by purchasing his partner, his wife, Charles was ensuring the protection of Euphemie, right? But unfortunately, in 1854, he dies. And even worse, he doesn't have a will. He dies interstate. And that kind of allowed his sneaky sister, his sneaky ass little sister, for lack of a better word, to come in and start a bunch of trouble. And she kind of creates this plan where she's like, you know what? Um, technically, technically speaking, I'm the only legal heir of my brother, because the wife and the children, they're slaves, so they don't, they can't get anything. You can't inherit property if you yourself are property, right? So she thought about this, and she was like, wait a minute, my sister-in-law and my nieces and nephews are my property, and so I could technically require them to work for me, so I don't have to pay other people to do it, and I could also sell them so I can get money. And I'm kind of already in debt, so that's actually a good idea. So that's what they did. They found this newspaper, and I will put it up on the screen. But essentially, from what I remember, the newspaper stated that basically that they had all of these slaves for sale. They describe Euphemie as mulâtresse, couturière, right? So like a mulatto, couturière is like a seamstress, yes. And my fourth great grandmother Brigitte was also listed for sale. She was described as a mulâtresse, and she was described as, I think also as a couturière. And that actually makes sense because when I found my fourth great grandmother later in the census and whatnot, she was her occupation was seamstress. So we see here that this is a very common theme in a lot of Creole culture where you do an occupation that your mom did, that your grandmother did, and those skills are just being passed on and on and on, right? So we could assume that my fourth great grandmother Brigitte learned the art, the skills, however you be a seamstress, from her mother, Euphémie. In the documents, they listed Charles, my fifth great grandfather, as not only a blacksmith but an engineer, and they said that he was either a mulatto or a quadroon. It confirms that Euphémie and Antoinette were Eve's children, and that Eve was a black woman who was enslaved for the entirety of her life, unfortunately. And it confirmed that Kachi, remember I said that when Euphémie's grandmother died, she became the property of her aunt. And the court documents confirmed that Kachi treated them as free, right? And so it also said that Euphémie and Antoinette, in addition, they made dresses for a living, right? So they made dresses, and they also they made cakes. So cute. They made cakes. That's what they did. And interestingly, it said that Kachi treated the girls as her nieces. I mean, they were her nieces, right? So Euphémie and her sister Antoinette were treated as family. And even Kachi allowed Charles Marin, right, my fifth great grandfather, before he purchased, Euphémie, Antoinette, and their children, he actually lived at the Lemelle residence, and Kachi let him live there for quite some time. And I think what's interesting. Oh yeah, and the documents. Before I go into that, the documents also confirm that Euphémie and Antoinette were indeed the granddaughters of Marie Jeanne Lemelle, right? And she treated them as family. What is most interesting is that it said that 17 people testified on Euphémie's behalf. That's a decent amount of people to not only for you to get into court. And it says among the 17 people that testified, there were respectable white men. And that's a really big deal, that not only did you have, you could gather up anyone, to say, oh yeah. But people in higher standing, people who had reputations, were coming in and trying to fight for these women of color. And I think that just shows you how much it is it kind of is a testament to the social power and the influence. Antoinette worked at a coffee shop, right? And that her boss, who was a white man, testified on her behalf and spoke to her character, said that she was always free to his knowledge. He was free to come in and ask for a job and work as a good employee to him. And so I think that really helped the case, that you had a lot of these people of quality who were coming in and saying, look, I know these young ladies. I've known them for their entire lives. They've always been free. This is a setup. Interestingly, they had so much information, quite frankly. Someone testified in the court also. One of the individuals testified that they knew Juliette, right, the sister-in-law who was trying to sell them, and they were like, Juliette was just walking around town telling people that Euphémie and them were her family. This story also highlights that slavery was really, for a lot of people, just an economic thing. It was, really driven by capitalist endeavors and greed. Very similar to what we see nowadays, where some people are going to do anything for money, even if that means selling out their own people, their own family. Juliette and her husband were not, they didn't care. And also, a lot of people don't think that, a lot of people try to romanticize the situation of slavery, and Louisiana, it just doesn't fit into these predetermined, preconceived notions of slavery that a lot of people have in their mind, unfortunately. A lot of people like to describe slavery in Louisiana, or just slavery in general, as something, us against them. This was something practiced by evil white people who were sick and evil, when that wasn't quite the case. We saw people like Juliette and her husband Jordan, who were very much people of color. They were even described as black, which could have been perhaps even a physical descriptor more so, right, in these court documents. And they were, not only did they own slaves already, but they were trying to sell their own family into slavery, right? And so it shows that it wasn't really, it wasn't this binary, like, okay, well, white people were doing this. Well, honestly, in Louisiana, a lot of people were doing slavery, whether they were white or people of color, or even people who were predominantly of African ancestry. That was just a thing. And Euphémie, really represented someone who was educated, determined, and I'm really proud that my fifth great grandmother was able to, especially not only as a person of color, but especially as a woman of color, she demonstrated really this bravery, and she's courageous enough to petition in front of the court, and despite all of these things that were going against her, being a woman, being of color, she won. And what's funny is that when she won the case, the judge also ordered for Juliette and her husband to pay all the legal. She didn't have enough money to pay, so she had to kind of like take out a loan or something and put up her house as like collateral. And I'm like, wow, you look real crazy now, because not only do you lost, but you don't even have the money to pay for the case that you lost. So you're big, dumb, broke, and mad. That's actually insane. But unfortunately, my sixth grade aunt, she kind of opened up a can of worms trying to sell her sister-in-law. That's kind of ghetto, and that's evil.
DJ Skyta, DJ Skyta, Snapchatting, WhatsApp ting, Snapchatting, WhatsApp ting, Snapchatting, WhatsApp ting, Snapchatting.